Hey y'all, it's Coach Krout
and Miss McKellar.
Welcome to
the Pastcast.
All right, here we are, episode 1 of the Pastcast. Why are we making a podcast?
So we're making a podcast because we want y'all to see real conversations that people have about history that are respectful, that are productive, and we want to make a way for students to look back and kind of get a review on content.
Exactly, yeah. So you can come back and watch these. We'll have them posted after we talk about different topics, and you can come back and listen to them if you're wanting to review for a test or for an essay, or even if you're just out of school that day when we talked about it, you can go back and watch these and kind of get an idea of what we talked about. Obviously, I teach South Carolina history. You might be wondering, what is Miss McKellar
Why
here?
am I here?
Yeah.
Fun fact, this is my first year not teaching South Carolina history.
Yeah.
This year I do yearbook and I do 7th grade world geography, but I've taught South Carolina history for 4 years. So
Yes.
I can talk about it still.
Exactly.
Even though I'm not teaching it. And I miss it a lot. So I'm glad I get to sit down with Miss Krout and we can just talk about it.
Yes. And you might also see in the future some guests, if you will, on the podcast talking about history.
Celebrity guests.
We have a lot of people in this building who know a lot about history. And so we are excited to get some guests on here in the future.
All right.
We'll be super excited.
Yeah.
So today we're talking about the Articles of Confederation. Just finished up with Unit 3, which was all about the American Revolution. Our essential question was, how did economic issues, political limitations, and social frustrations contribute to the colonists uniting and seeking independence? So students studied the American Revolution to answer that question, and then they just submitted essays answering that question. And they were really good essays. They did a good job.
I heard that they worked really hard on them.
Yeah, they did. They worked really hard. So now we're starting into a new unit. This unit will be studying how did weaknesses in the Articles of Confederation lead to the creation of a stronger federal government under the U.S.
So what was the Articles of Confederation?
That's a great question. So we fought in the American Revolution, and it was towards the end of the war that our political leaders who were leading the country throughout the war, these were the guys who had met in the Continental Congress. They decided we need to have some form of government set up so that way when the war ends, we're not just left in mass chaos. And so they sat down and they drafted a constitution, a set of rules, if you will, and they named them the Articles of Confederation. So it was our nation's first set of laws.
And how did it go with the Articles? Was it a success or was it a fail?
Well, I guess that's what we're going to be talking about today, because it's kind of, there's some strengths and there's some weaknesses of the Articles, but we're going to see that ultimately in the end, it doesn't really work out for the Articles of Confederation.
Yeah, because as we know, we have the Constitution of the United States, not the Articles of Confederation.
Exactly.
So I think that's a little foreshadowing to how this is going to turn out.
Exactly. So like starting off with what the Articles were, some weaknesses of it. For one thing, they couldn't tax the people directly.
And that was really important to the colonists because, as you know, no taxation without representation, that was a hot topic for colonists. And so, of course, they would want a constitution where they weren't forced to be taxed.
Exactly. Yeah. And pre the American Revolution, during the time of salutary neglect, the colonies got to decide how they were taxing. So South Carolina itself would decide how South Carolinian colonists would be taxed. And so with the Articles of Confederation, the idea was that the states would just collect the taxes, but the national federal government wouldn't be able to tax the citizens directly.
So, Ms. Krout, you said a word that I think some students might not know. Salutary neglect. What does that mean? So
we talked about that in the American Revolution. It was a time period pre the American Revolution where I like to call it in my classroom hands-off parenting. And so Great Britain was like, if you're making us money and you are shipping raw materials to us and buying our manufactured goods, we're not going to have hands-on parenting. We're going to have hands-off. We're just going to leave you alone and kind of let you govern yourself and decide the rules for yourself. And so it was a time period of really where the colonists got to rule themselves. And Great Britain didn't really have like that hands-on parenting. Whereas then after the French and Indian War, massive debt, we know how that goes. They ended up having more hands-on parenting, and they started taxing the colonists again.
Which made them really unhappy.
Exactly.
Okay.
Hence the American Revolution.
So what were some other flaws with the Articles of Confederation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So another thing is that they couldn't actually pay soldiers, so they couldn't form a national military. In order to pay soldiers to be a part of a national military, they had to ask the states to donate money.
And did the states want to donate money?
No. And if it was just a suggestion for me to give money, I don't think I would give my money either.
I mean, fair. Little rude, but fair. I get it. So we didn't have a really strong military because they weren't funded.
Yeah.
They didn't have
if I was a
uniforms or
soldier,
weapons.
yeah, if I was a soldier and I wasn't getting paid, I wouldn't show up to work.
No, I definitely wouldn't put my life on the line.
Yeah, so
when
that'd
I'm
be
not getting
problematic
paid.
for sure. Yeah, and then another thing was there was no executive leader, which we haven't really talked about the three branches of government, so I don't really think they would know what an executive leader is. So do you want to explain that to them?
Yeah, so think of an executive leader or president today. The executive branch today of the United States doesn't just consist of the president, but the president is the leader of the executive branch. So the reason why the colonists didn't really want to have an executive branch is it kind of gave them flashbacks to the King of England, who they felt like had too much control, had too much power, and they did not want one person to have too much power over these colonists again.
Yeah, which is fair. Again, when you just went through the American Revolution, you went through everything you did with the taxes and not having a say in the government, and the king is a tyrant. You don't really want to have one person having a lot of control over your government. That would be scary. And then the next thing is really like only the states could impose tariffs and only the states could negotiate trade. So that's a word that we've talked about a little bit, but not a lot. So what's a tariff?
So a tariff is essentially a tax on imported goods. So there's two words you need to know: import and export. Import is goods you're taking in from other countries. Export is when you take your products and send out to other countries. So what would be the benefit of putting a tariff on a good, Coach Krout?
That's a great question. So we also have tariffs today. Basically what it does is if you put a tax on goods coming into your country, then it essentially makes the goods that you're making in your own country cheaper than the ones coming in from another country. So let's just say, for example, they're shipping in tea from France. I don't know why France is making tea. They're not known for it, but they're shipping in tea from France, right? And we're making tea here in the colonies. Well, if we put a tax on that tea coming in from France, then it's $4 a box, whereas the tea here in South Carolina would only be $2 a box.
So it makes people want to buy the American-made products.
Exactly. Because who doesn't want to save money? Why would you want to spend more on tea when you could spend less?
No idea.
Exactly. So the fact that only the states could decide what they put tariffs on, and the fact that the states had complete control over their trade, made it really messy and kind of difficult for other nations to kind of understand how the system works. Because France wouldn't make trade deals with the United States. They would have to make trade deals with South Carolina and North Carolina and Virginia and New York. And so then they end up having 13 different trade deals.
Yeah, and a lot of different trade laws. So that's confusing because if they go to trade with South Carolina, it can be completely different if they just go and trade with Georgia.
Exactly.
That could be so problematic. Yeah. And it was. And so what happened to these trades? Do these European countries continue trading with the states?
No. So basically it was just too complicated. So they didn't really want to trade with us anymore. And then it also led to competition between the states. So you would have a state like North Carolina here. Oh, well, they're buying tea from France for $4 and they're shipping more tea over there. Maybe we'll say we'll buy it for $5.
Ooh.
Right. And so then they start shipping more tea into North Carolina than South Carolina. And so it ends up being like competition between the states. And ultimately, you don't want your states competing with each other. You want us as a unified group working together as a country kind of against the other countries, you know, instead of North Carolina siding with France over South Carolina. It's just not very good for your country.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Were there any other weaknesses of the articles?
So another thing was each state only had one vote. So
why is that problematic?
Yeah. So when they would get together, when they would get together as a government to create laws within their legislation system. Because in my class, if I say legislation, you should think of the word law, because that means to create laws. So when they would get together to create these laws, each state only had one vote.
Ooh.
But that would make larger states really angry. So states like Virginia that had a larger population than states like New Jersey would get upset because they had more people living in their state. So it felt like New Jersey was getting more of a say than Virginia was.
It sounds fair for every state to get one vote. But think about it this way. Let's say each classroom in the 8th grade hallway had a vote. But maybe Coach Krout's class has 10 students. Well, maybe my class has 20.
Yes.
It's actually not fair for every class to have one vote.
Exactly.
And it especially made the larger states with more students or more people very upset.
Exactly. It essentially gives each person in that state more of a say than each person in the bigger state. And so that really made larger states angry. So it was another weakness and kind of, again, a point of like discussion and debate where we have states arguing with one another. So we're just not unified.
Yeah, it sounds like the states are just not getting along under the Articles of Confederation.
They're not. But it wasn't all bad.
Okay.
There was a couple good things about the Articles of Confederation. For one, again, we had to have some form of government set up in order to win the war, because we have to have a government who can declare war, who can make treaties and things like that. You can't end a war without a treaty. And so we had to have some sort of form of government set up. And this did allow us to win the war. And it did allow for some form of order after the American Revolution. It was better than having nothing. And then the other thing, too, is that if you remember with the French and Indian War, we had this proclamation of 1763, which meant that the colonists couldn't move past the Appalachian Mountains. Well, after we won the war, they could move past the Appalachian Mountains. But the whole reason Great Britain didn't want us to move past because it was going to lead to conflict.
Conflict with who?
With the Native Americans.
Oh, so like you're telling me the Native Americans didn't really appreciate for people coming in and taking their land.
Exactly.
I can't imagine why.
Exactly, yes. And so as we start flooding into what was called the Northwest Territory, it's basically just the area around Ohio. It caused a lot of conflict with Native Americans. And so the Articles of Confederation, they were allowed to pass laws. It was called the Northwest Ordinance, that allowed for peace in that area, some sort of peace. There was still a little bit of conflict, but that was a success too. It was probably the greatest success of the Articles of Confederation. But again, all of those negatives versus 2 positives, it's not a really great system.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like the articles make the states stronger together.
No, it's definitely causing a lot of division during this time. And we see this kind of all bubble up with one big event. There was one big event that happened that showed everyone this isn't working.
So what was that big event?
Shays Rebellion. So Daniel Shay was a farmer, okay? And so during this time, a lot of these farmers had served in the American Revolution as patriot soldiers, and they're waiting to get paid. They haven't been paid from the war.
So why haven't they gotten paid?
Basically, because the national government can't tax the states, they can't raise the money to pay back the debts they have from the war.
So the Articles of Confederation, like we just talked about, they had to rely on donations, and states didn't really want to donate to pay these soldiers.
Exactly.
Little rude.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, a bunch of veterans that you don't want to pay, that's terrible.
Yeah.
But they're not getting paid, but they're farmers and they still need to like work and make a living. And so they've bought farms using loans from a bank. Okay. And so when they buy these farms using loans from a bank, eventually they have to pay the bank back.
You do.
But because they're not getting paid from the American Revolution, they can't pay their loans back.
Which means they could lose their farms, right?
Exactly. So the banks were coming in and they were taking their farms, and that made them very angry, and they wanted the government to do something about it. They wanted them to step in and figure out some way to get them their payments so they could keep their farms. And when it was evident that the government wasn't going to be able to do that, Daniel Shay gathered together a group of farmers and led a rebellion. And so this rebellion starts. They're not able to like put the rebellion down. They can't tax the people. They can't raise a strong enough army to put down this rebellion.
They're in such a pickle.
Exactly.
So how do they eventually stop this revolution?
So basically, over time it kind of simmers down, but it showed to them the fact that they weren't able to immediately just stop it using the armed forces. Something had to happen. We had to shift something about the way that we were governing the people, so that way we had enough control to not have mass chaos.
I mean, fair. So they decide to get rid of the Articles of Confederation.
Yes.
Because of Shays Rebellion. So what do they do next?
It was actually a huge debate whether or not we should get rid of the Articles of Confederation, because some people said the alternative is to create a stronger government, and we don't want a tyrant like King George. So it was a big debate, but eventually they end up deciding there's no way we can revise these or edit these to make them strong enough. We're going to have to get rid of them. So they're going to hold what was called the Constitutional Convention, where they're going to write the Constitution.
So they have to start all over.
Exactly.
Wow.
And there's a lot of problems to work through, like we talked about.
Right. So they have to create a new government that fixes all those problems that we just talked about.
Exactly. It's going to take a long time.
Are they going to do it?
I mean, I hope so, or else we're not going to have a government. Well, that's all for our past cast this week. Thank you for tuning in. If you have any questions you would like us to answer on our next past cast, go ahead and send a Schoology message to myself or Miss McKellar, and we'll be happy to address those. And next episode, we're excited to talk about the Constitutional Convention.
Yay! Thank you for tuning in.
We'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.